The world barely noticed it at first. A moment of seemingly mundane diplomacy between two neighbors, the United States and Canada. On the surface, it was just another routine negotiation. Another decision passed behind closed doors. But underneath, the ripple effects of this one rejection could not be ignored. A quiet act of defiance, perhaps, but with consequences that stretched well beyond the immediate exchange. Canada's rejection of Washington's final offer was framed as a simple refusal, but it signaled something far more complicated. The United States had assumed it was holding all the cards. After all, the relationship between the two nations is often portrayed as the epitome of close ties, economic, political, and cultural. But in this moment, Canada dared to make a move that upended the carefully constructed narrative. This was not just a diplomatic disagreement. It was a challenge to a power structure that had long been assumed to be impenetrable. The rejection, delivered with calculated politeness, shook the political and economic machinery in both capitals. Washington had assumed that Canada's dependence on U.S. trade and security would ensure compliance, even in a moment of discomfort. But Canada, with a mix of measured self-interest and calculated independence, rejected Washington's demands, sending a message to both allies and adversaries that it was willing to assert its autonomy when the stakes were high. The immediate consequences were subtle. The markets hardly budged. The press played the story with a few sensational headlines, and the world moved on to the next crisis. But the long-term implications were already beginning to unfurl. Canada had made its move, and in doing so, it had sparked a series of questions about the future of North American relations, the power balance within international alliances, and most importantly, the real dynamics at play behind the closed doors of geopolitics. For Washington, the rejection was a blow to its credibility. The assumption that Canada would always be a willing partner, that the U.S. could dictate terms when needed, had been shattered. What Washington had failed to see was the depth of Canada's quiet but growing discontent with the status quo. This was not a simple case of one country rejecting another's offer. This was a moment that highlighted the shifting nature of power dynamics in the 21st century. A subtle but potent reminder that even the closest of allies have limits. And in the world of geopolitics, those limits can be far more dangerous than anyone realizes. To understand why Canada rejected Washington's final offer, we must first examine the institutional framework that governs such decisions. At its core, the refusal was not about the personalities involved or a singular diplomatic clash. It was the result of systemic pressures that had been building for years. The rejection was a product of both historical precedent and the changing global dynamics that have shifted the calculus of power in ways that both countries might have underestimated. Historically, the US-Canada relationship has been rooted in shared interests, trade, defense, and economic cooperation. The North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, now replaced by the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, USMCA, has long been a cornerstone of the relationship. For decades, Canada has been a key trading partner and a critical ally in terms of regional security. The reliance on the US has created a nearly symbiotic bond between the two nations, a relationship that has been convenient, predictable, and mutually beneficial. But this reliance has also bred a sense of complacency, where Washington assumed that its power would automatically translate into cooperation. At the institutional level, Canada's decision to reject Washington's offer is not a reflection of sudden antagonism, but a product of evolving institutional thinking. The shift has been gradual, but significant. Canada's political leadership, particularly in recent years, has begun to question the efficacy of this dependence. Political institutions in Canada have shifted in response to growing domestic concerns, which include trade imbalances, environmental policies, and the broader question of national identity in a world increasingly defined by multipolarity. Canada's decision-makers, aware of the external pressures from emerging powers like China and Russia, have found themselves rethinking their traditional alignment with the US in favor of pursuing a more independent path that might better serve their long-term interests. Moreover, Canada's political system has undergone significant changes in terms of global engagement. The rise of more populist, nationalistic voices within Canada has catalyzed a re-examination of the relationship with the US. These forces have pushed against the notion that the US holds an unquestioned moral and political high ground. The institutional shift toward more assertive nationalism has also been compounded by the ongoing debates about climate change, Indigenous rights, and trade policy. For Canada, rejecting Washington's offer was not just a diplomatic maneuver. It was a calculated decision driven by the evolving narrative within the political elite and a changing societal sentiment. For the US, on the other hand, the institutional setup has traditionally assumed that its influence over Canada's policies was unquestioned. American policymakers, conditioned by decades of close ties, could not fathom a world where their influence did not have a guaranteed return. The US had come to expect that Canada, facing its own internal challenges, would always side with Washington when push came to shove. The assumption was simple. Canada needs the US more than the US needs Canada. This miscalculation is rooted in an outdated understanding of global power structures. What many in Washington failed to see was that Canada's rejection was not simply an act of defiance. It was a response to structural pressures within the Canadian system that demanded a shift in approach. Canada's institutions, from its political leaders to its bureaucracies, were now operating under a new logic, one that recognized the importance of maintaining sovereignty, while also engaging in a broader, more diverse range of international relationships. Canada's rejection, therefore, was a manifestation of a much deeper shift within its institutional psyche. It was a response to the growing realization that alliances, even the closest ones, must be based on mutual respect and reciprocity, not just historical habits. Washington's response to Canada's rejection was predictable, but that is what made it a miscalculation. In the corridors of US power, the assumption was simple. Canada would bend. The US has long been the dominant partner in North America, with political, economic, and military influence that seemed unquestionable. For years, this balance of power between the two nations was seen as a given, an institutional fact. But the US failed to anticipate that this power dynamic was changing, both in the United States and within Canada itself. The miscalculation was not just in Canada's rejection. It was in Washington's failure to grasp the shifting currents of global and domestic politics. The US had become accustomed to leveraging its overwhelming strength to ensure compliance from its neighbors and allies. The idea that Canada might reject Washington's offer was not just unthinkable. It was almost seen as an impossibility. In Washington, decision makers tend to view international relations through a transactional lens. Trade agreements, security alliances, and diplomatic ties are seen as bargains where the US holds most of the leverage. With Canada, the thinking was straightforward. The US had the economic might, military power, and international clout to enforce its will. The idea that Canada could stand its ground without suffering long-term consequences seemed absurd. After all, what leverage did Canada have in comparison? But that is precisely where the miscalculation occurred. Canada was not simply rejecting a single offer. It was asserting a broader point about its evolving geopolitical position. The United States had not accounted for the slow tectonic shifts in Canada's domestic policies and international strategy. For one, Canada's increased focus on diversifying its trade relationships, especially with Asia and Europe, had begun to pay off. As Washington increasingly isolated itself on the global stage, Canada found itself with more room to maneuver, seeking alternative partnerships that lessened its reliance on the US. Moreover, Canada had become more confident in its diplomatic stance. As Washington retreated from multilateralism, particularly during the latter years of the Trump administration, Canada found itself on the front lines of preserving global agreements on climate change, trade, and human rights. This evolving role gave Canada a new sense of agency, and with it, the confidence to challenge Washington's demands. On top of that, Canada's political leadership had begun to recognize that their country's interests were not always aligned with those of the US, especially in areas like environmental policy and resource management. While Washington might have been focused on energy extraction and trade deals that served its immediate interests, Canada's leaders were increasingly mindful of public sentiment, environmental sustainability, and long-term economic stability. Washington's miscalculation was a reflection of an outdated mindset. U.S. officials were still working with the assumptions of the post-World War II order, where the U.S. was the unquestioned leader, and Canada.